We're gonna get started here. Grab a seat, please. So, a couple of things. I'm so excited about this. It's sick. We just showed this book. In this book, Jeff writes about a number of different case studies. And these case studies are really remarkable. Everything from the FBI. But he also talks about some stuff that happened at Salesforce, about a group that was a little ragtag group and thought, you know, the things that we're doing, the world's changing for our world, and this is about 8 years ago? 7 years ago?
I don't know. No, that's going to make me sound old, so I'll never admit it.
So last week, when she was 16,
It's true.
yeah, she's just turning 17.
No, I only look that way.
You look great, by the way.
I know. I look like 17.
And she's on this princess chair, so it's great.
Yes.
It all works out.
Yes.
Nicola Dourambeis is written up in this book, and it's a great little story about how Nicola helped influence and change an organization to which many of us, looking outside, when people say, well, what's an organization that's doing Agile look like? And we say, Salesforce. They're doing some cool stuff over there. And they've got some pretty cool coaches, and they're pretty smart. And they've figured a lot of stuff out. Some stuff they're working on. And it's remarkable, right? It's in this book. And so when I first read it, I thought, well, who's Nicola? Which isn't how you pronounce Nicola's name. And I'm like, I got to meet this Nicola. And sure enough, I don't know how we've found a way to meet each other, but I was able to have a real meaningful conversation about leadership with Nicola. And for the first time, I had someone to speak with who's at that executive level, who's been accustomed to speaking with the CEO of a very large company, the CIO of a very large company, and helping influence not just process change, but how we think and how we behave and what's involved in that. So Nicola has been involved in a number of different transformations. Of course, Salesforce is what she's known for, but she's also engaged with other clients. I don't know if I can say it or not. Like, so rhymes with eBay. It rhymes with eBay, and if you and her current client is really thinking through not just Agile for Agile's sake, not just doing Agile, but Nicola's coming from a perspective of, well, gosh, you know, what's our being? Where are we at? Tying into what Luke had said this morning. So Nicola's been very influential in the stuff that I've been thinking about and how I work with other executives, and she's helped me kind of think through in a more deeper way, where are we coming from in terms of culture? How do we influence not just the processes, that's one thing, but how do we influence culture? And that's reinforced by with other people I work with, like Eva over at StubHub, has helped me think through a little bit deeper on culture. So that ties right into what Nicola's doing. So I'm so grateful for having Nicola as a friend. She did have a little bit of an accident, so she's going to be up here today. If you've got questions, we'll do questions at the end. But with that said, Nicola.
Mr. Wildly. Hi. How are you guys? How was lunch? All right, firstly, I'm going to apologize for being on a pedestal, although I got to confess to you, I've always wanted to be on one. 6 weeks ago, I broke my leg in a spectacular paddleboarding accident, which you think paddleboarding very calm. Not in Maui. Wave crashed over me, board went in, took out my shin. I have a bionic leg, but it's not quite bionic yet. So normally I'm a lot more dynamic. Now I'm just going to be wildly gesturing. So sorry about that. But what I'm really excited to talk to you guys about is culture and cultural agility. And what I'm thrilled to see are so many of the talks today are around that piece. Because I feel like the Agile community for such a long time was really focused on tools and frameworks and implementation of them. And then what we saw was, the minute these coaches go away, everything goes backwards. And the reason, and what I always say is, every time I go into a company and they tell me their transformation isn't going that well, I ask them if they started with a tool. Now, with all great respect to my tool colleagues here, tools are there to enable results, as Luke was talking about, right? Agile Manifesto, rule 1, right? People over tools, right? People over process. So things are great, right? While we love the things on the right, the stuff on the left is even more important to us. And I do a lot of work in transformation, and I have a playbook about transformation, and some of you actually have been kind enough to hear it. But the piece that I think is pivotal is this idea of culture. And that's what I want to talk to you guys about today. So, and this is, by the way, we're cheating out. They're clicking for me, I'm clicking for myself. So if you see some wild stuff, we're revealing what's under the covers. So this is me. My space of interest is really organizational change. I got into Agile as a waterfall project manager. I read about it in 2003, and it made sense to me. It made sense to me because actually I have a master's degree in sociology, which I totally hid from everybody for the longest time because it was like a soft science. But it was around how do people in organizations behave and think, and Agile brought it all together. So that's what I really, really deeply care about. I got my start back in 2004 when we had fake project plans in front of clients. And we did secret Agile in the back because that was the only way that we knew how to deliver and lower risk. And since then, I've worked with some really big clients. Like I spent a year with British Telecom doing the 100-year rollout. And I've also worked with cool companies like Twitter and Zendesk around just innovative things, some startups. And as Stacy said, I spent close to 6 years at Salesforce. I took their transformation from, and we're going to talk about it today, from sort of a mechanics state that was a really good mechanics implementation to what I characterize as cultural agility on my scale. And there are a bunch of Salesforce alum and people here, and it is a credit to every single person who's ever been there, because it was never our work. It was what we were able to enable and get other people to really embrace. So that's me. Now, I want to talk about 3 things. It's the rule of 3. The first one I'm going to do is just actually talk about what I mean by cultural agility, because I feel like I'm playing a little bit of buzzword bingo on you. So I'm going to define what I'm talking about, and then I want to give you some stories around 3 different companies, where they were at, what we were able to do against where they were in their sort of cultural evolution. So Salesforce will be one of them, but I'll also give you 2 others, because my premise is we can always get better, but we need to be really realistic about what is possible given the amount of change that we're able to do and absorb. And I think as Agile coaches, we're always really hard on ourselves. And at Salesforce, I was never satisfied, right? I always wanted to do more. I always wanted to push further. I would obsess over the things that hadn't quite met the excellence that they could be and reach their potential. And what I've come to realize now are, under the constraints that exist within an ecosystem, what is good enough and what is the place that we can be proud and the first stepping point that's both aggressive enough but also sustaining. And then I just want to give you kind of my playbook around the culture side, around what do I do to try and uncover this and deal with it. So, okay, what is cultural agility? So, click. It was a quick one. I tricked you guys. So, cool that Luke talked about this, because I also talk about this being versus doing. You know, I think that doing Agile means teams execute mechanics. Not bad. Not a terrible thing. They probably are executing better than they have executed without those mechanics. Those are great things. But what I want to talk about when I'm talking about Agile is, what are your behaviors? How do you feel? How do you think? What do you do in situations of stress, which is really when the real truth comes out? And my best example story to illustrate this is healthcare.gov. So healthcare.gov, as we know, had a little bit of a rocky start, to put it mildly. And It did because of all the characteristics of organizational dysfunction, right? Multiple companies working in a siloed fashion, competing against each other, not talking, not integrating, and lo and behold, things went up and nothing worked together. So this amazing tag team of people came in to rescue healthcare.gov, and they thought they were going in for a weekend. They wound up living nights and weekends for 6 weeks to do it. Now, none of these people would characterize themselves as Agile. But what did they do? First thing they did, small cross-functional team. They started doing daily stand-ups. They started putting in tests and tests and tests and making information super visible to have quick feedback loops so that they can incrementally iterate off of that. I call that Agile. I don't care if they did Scrum. I don't care what rule they did, what framework, what tool they used. That to me is being Agile. And that's really sort of the way that I'm characterizing it in this. So culture then, and I Googled this. I was like, how do we define culture? So culture is basically your beliefs, your norms, how you behave without thinking of them. And so many of us at work have interviewed for culture fit. And it's the, like, do they get us? Do they think the way we do? And it's important, right? Because that's how ecosystems thrive and live. And it's also why it makes culture such a difficult thing to change, because it is how you behave when you're not even thinking about it. So do you walk into a company and see everybody emails each other and nobody talks? I remember the first time I started working at a startup, I was sitting like this close to somebody and they were emailing me, and that seemed weird because there was not a wall, it was open space. And I'm like, oh, I get it. This is a culture where they don't feel safe to have a conversation, so they want it all documented. That's messed up. Now, do I adhere to that culture? And I did, right? I was like, well, I'm going to email him back and cover my butt. But that's a cultural norm. And if you now want to upend this culture and say, actually, we value individual interactions, right? And I don't think we're talking well together on email. Can we have a conversation? Just recognize you're changing a norm that's deeply, deeply embedded that people don't even consciously recognize as something they do. So that's kind of my definition of culture for this, which then means what is cultural agility? And it's where the norms of an organization are just inherently agile. And I contend the reason why Salesforce was able to get as quick an adoption to agile mechanics as they did, and they did quite a quick one. In 3 months, they sort of went all in, was because the underlying values of the company were around incrementally delivering to customers, getting customer feedback, and hiring people who valued team. So even though in their journey, they went into this big waterfall experience where they had been really stuck in the way they delivered, because they had those cultural sort of underpinnings, it wasn't that difficult to craft a story that was a return to our original values of how we work. And people went, I get it. This makes sense to me. So that's sort of how I'm defining kind of cultural agility. And I think it's also tightly coupled to what some people call business agility, which is the ability to change direction on your business fairly rapidly in a humane, sound, successful, comfortable way. And then it looks like, to me, we're always looking for systemic blockers. We're always trying to remove whatever is hurting us. You know, at Salesforce, we would have these brainstorm sessions around like, how do we get rid of every process or tool we think is stupid? And we would call it stupid. We're like, oh, here we have this process that exists because we don't trust people. That sucks. Why do we need this approval? Oh, it's because we don't trust people to do the right thing. So how do we sort of dig into that? So we were always looking at, if you're going to add a process, what do you remove? And as you scale, and many of you are from large organizations, you know you can just stranglehold an organization under process where people execute process, but they have no idea what that process is designed to resolve. So you've got this idea of always sort of clearing the systemic blockers, and then leaders and managers can make better decisions. Why? Because they've pushed them down. right? That's the secret sauce, but it's really hard. Teams have more ownership, and as a result, they feel more accountable for results and they show more success. And then the overall company outcomes are better, right? You don't do Agile because it sounds cool. You do Agile to achieve a certain result. So that's kind of my nirvana. And by the way, even the best of companies, I think, are always on a transformation journey to get better. So I'm going to do my 3 company tales, and I'm going to start with my evolution picture. So these are 3 companies that I've been working with over the past couple years. The last one, Salesforce, I'm going to give it away, and that is my nirvana. And by the way, they're not perfect, but on the scale. So the first one, and let me sort of paint a picture of the business situation. It was a company that had been around for 30 years. Most people in the company, average tenure is about 11 years with the company. Certain people, 30 years, right? People stay there a really long time. Partly because it's in a place where there isn't a lot of job mobility. So it's just like Silicon Valley, right? There's a ton of job mobility. So if people aren't happy, they find jobs. This was not in a location that was as friendly towards that. The other reason was, it had good benefits, was a fairly solid brand name company. They had early on in their history built a product that had such market penetration, they didn't have to deliver well, because they just owned the market. And business imperatives now had changed, and they had to change their product. It wasn't even a competitor itching at their heel. The actual product had to change, and guess what? They do not know how to change. They do not know how to ship software. They do not know how to do those things that most companies, especially if you're a startup, right? You perform or you die. They've never had that situation, or they did so long ago that they don't have that in their DNA. So their CEO understood this and decided, we are going to go Agile because the stakes are so high that if we do not change, we will die. Great. So hire a bunch of consultants. So here's what we found. First thing we did was look around. Here's the environment. Not surprising to most people in this room, right? It was a very command and control, right? Very hierarchical, very much an environment that was highly leader-led. In fact, to the degree that if an engineer was given a technology to work on and they thought that technology was a poor choice and they articulated that, they were told to shut up and do it anyway. And if it invariably failed because that engineer actually knew what they were doing, they were told to replace it, and there was no sort of acknowledgement of that. Now, because these folks weren't really quitting, they sort of were in this bad relationship with their organization. Morale was pretty low, but they weren't going anywhere. The organization was highly siloed against business units that all had P&L, but there weren't products against each business unit. To get a product out the door, you had to go through multiple business units, right? So it's the Moore's Law, right? Your organizational silo and your software are going to be tightly coupled. No standards. No development standards, no quality standards, no requirement standards, no definition of customer value, nothing. Blank slate. Because it was built on this tacit knowledge of these hyper specialists all over the place. And how many people know how great hyper specialists work in Agile, right? I mean, it's not so good, right? We need them to start generalizing. So the environment was probably one of the most hostile environments to bringing in Agile that I had seen. But I think the best place to change is on the heels of a crisis. And I believe that so strongly that every time we wanted to launch a change program at Salesforce, if there wasn't a crisis, we invented one. It's actually really easy to do. People are quitting. Oh, we've got an attrition problem. Okay, so we're going to have an innovation program to make sure people are happy, and we're pushing decision-making down because everybody's going to quit. Woo! You can do these things, but they had a real crisis. Didn't have to invent one. So what did we do? I'm going to be honest. We talked to the leadership, and we gave them a mirror and said, this is your environment. And they said, no. Not true. if we could just make our people more accountable. If they would just come in earlier in the morning and work a little bit harder. So they didn't get it. And I'm going to, posit that the only way to invoke cultural change is both bottom up and top down both. So we didn't have the top down. And in a million years, it wasn't going to happen. Now, I don't want to throw up my hands and say, well, good luck to you. Hope you go out of business in 3 years. Because there's human beings who are putting their heart and soul into their work, and we got to take care of them. So what we did was we found the pockets. We created a counterculture that we could, right? Who actually is inherently agile? It's in their DNA, right? They value working together. They value doing it. And how do we craft an environment where they can survive? And that is what we did, right? We found those pockets. We helped them learn Scrum, train them up, did it, and just focused on the layer above them, unblocking them. And do I feel like that was like an implementation of agility that I put on my resume? No. But in that environment, did we make it better? Yes. And I feel like that's a really important thing to talk about. Can you advance a slide? Because we can't achieve nirvana in every environment, and it's unfair to try. We can always try, but it's unfair to expect that of ourselves to achieve those results, right? We need enough support systems within the overall ecosystem to be able to do that. So the teams who are doing Scrum actually were happier. And by the way, success breeds success. So if I can start showcasing the heck out of these teams that are these sort of curious counterculture rebels and make being a rebel cool, then maybe other people will want to come on board and try. And maybe their managers will start to see they're getting more successful because the outcomes they're accountable for are being delivered in a different way. And maybe we're starting the snowball effect very, very slowly. So what I would say is the overall culture agile? No. Will it ever be? I don't know. But even with these leadership behaviors and all the organizational siloing, which we could not impact, I do think we saw progress. And that's kind of my piece of this. And it's a little bit of my story because I constantly talk to people in very large companies, which are most of my clients, and they feel very beaten down by the systemic blockers that exist versus reflective of the successes that they're able to build. And I really want us to be understanding that and amplifying that and also being realistic. So when I talk to that CEO is not going to get the nirvana that, Jeff Sutherland describes in that book, right? They're not going to show those results. You're not going to have high-performing teams in that environment, but you will see a baby step forward, and hopefully the steps keep moving forward. So let me go sort of next one. So the situation of this company, and this is a company I worked with last year, was not that different in that it was also like a 25-year-old company, and they had a real niche specialization. They were deeply embedded on-prem, so their knowledge in an area was awesome. And the people that understood that and the expertise was awesome. What wasn't awesome was their ability to execute. So they had previously been an on-premise company, and now their customers were asking two things of them. One was, we want cloud. And the other thing that they were really looking from them was a platform solution so that they could build all these crazy apps because their customers actually knew their business better than anyone else, and the business was so specialized that they really wanted capabilities versus an all-in-one solution, right? A lot of IT organizations are hiring pretty smart IT people, and they didn't want sort of software in a box anymore, which meant all of the people and the way that they were working had to be rethought. And again, I don't know if the stakes were at a point of in 3 years you're going to go under, but you could have made that. And what had happened was, honestly, the promises that had been made to customers had not been realized. They spent 2 years trying to ship software. In the end, that software had to be thrown out, which sucks, right? Because here's what they had actually asked people to do. They had this very strong executive who had made promises to his board that they would deliver this list of features against a timeline, and then went to his team and said, get it done. And when the team started to surface that it's probably kind of hard to do that, they were told, let's take Saturdays away from people. So what had happened, true story, right, kind of breaks your heart, was after people had spent a summer working Saturdays and working very long hours, they threw out that software. I know, the moans, right? The moans. The moans. Heartbreaking, right? Because nobody wants that experience. So morale sucked. Also, even more than that, the entire organization had an inherent distrust in technology. Tech doesn't deliver. Salespeople have nothing to sell. Marketing has nothing to market. So it wasn't just that the technology organization had dealt with this really, really real difficult environment. It was that inside the organization, they had very little credibility. The executive who was doing these things actually wound up getting fired, which was good news. But let's be honest, replacing that executive wasn't going to be magic, because how people behaved was learned behavior over a long period of time. So managers in this world had a ton of power. They built the teams, they came up with the estimates, they came up with the designs, and they liked that job. They had a ton of authority. And they didn't feel personal accountability for the failures of their teams who couldn't perform, which is sort of interesting. They didn't quite sort of connect the two. So this was the environment. Oh, and the other piece was 2 years earlier, they had allegedly transformed to Agile. That's what I was told. They had. No, come on, don't laugh. So every 6 months they shipped. But every week they had a meeting called a scrum. They sat in a room. Project manager had everything on a projector, and they updated tasks in Jira. That's Scrum. That's Agile. So then when I'm sort of picking in, trying to understand, I see one-liners in Jira called user stories. And I see all these weird artifacts. And that one's even tougher, right? Because you've got to unlearn that this kind of super crappy process that they're using actually isn't Agile at all. It is the worst hybrid of waterfall and Agile possible, right? Because at least in waterfall, you took the time to write down the requirements. Now we got lazy and wrote one-liners all over the place and called it like, oh, we're Agile. So we had to also address that piece too, because when you go in, you can't use the word Agile, because Agile is already this, oh, we went through this and it didn't solve our problems, right? We didn't get out of hot water. So what did we do? Here's Katniss. She's power, man. So I always go back to training everyone. I believe super strongly about the transformational power of a 2-day training class. I really, really do. Because you take people on a journey of doing and you try and get hearts and minds. So we trained everyone. I usually start with the executive team because they don't know anything. And they think they know everything. And to be fair to them, in order for them to do their job successfully, they need to know everything. So if we start with this understanding that they have the highest degree of risk with every decision they make, and we feel really kind about that, we set them up for success first. And we empower them to make wise decisions versus just kind of going, ugh, they don't get it. And to their credit, they came. It wasn't like my first scenario where they, kind of fired me. It was like they came. And we invited HR to the party. because how many organizations fail because we have this really, really crappy performance management system that rewards heroics, that reinforces this idea of individual achievement over team success. And because we had a pretty cool HR department, candidly, we invited them to the party because they wanted to learn. And that was cool. In fact, I tried to get some salespeople there. The challenge with getting salespeople in those things, and this is, just my experience for anyone who's in sales and wonderful, they talk a lot in those classes. And, bless their hearts, because I talk a lot too, but, we kind of didn't want it to be about that. Like, I can do sales for Scrum, so thank you. And then we created persistent teams, because so much of the waste in the system was every time there was a new requirement, we created a new project and a new project team, and I'm seeing a ton of people nod their heads, right? How hard is that? And we always pick the same 4 people, because they're the only people who know anything, for goodness sake. And when you craft this persistent team across the organization, you see a couple of things. One is the organization is not built for these teams. And what we've been is hyper-reliant on these specialists across the board. And now we have to reward them to cross-train. And for people who were getting paid really, really well to be this certain hero, that's hard. And we have to fill in the gaps of hiring, and we have to have a really candid conversation that the organization might not be able to deliver all these great requirements. We just can't. We don't have those people. We don't have people who understand full cycle, and we're creating these teams that have certain capabilities, but they're gonna have to slow down to speed up. And we're gonna have to get them to be more of a self-fulfilling engine, right? This team that can build things as an autonomous group versus I'm relying on Joe because Joe's the person who built the code 15 years ago and they're the only one who knows how to do it, and there's no tests there because tests might actually tell me what it does. So we had to build these persistent teams, which was really, really revolutionary, and we had them bottom-up plan. And I cannot advocate enough for the power of bottom-up release planning. It's no magic sauce. If you look at Agile Estimating and Planning, Mike Cohn, he talks through it. That's where I learned it. Bottom-up planning is profoundly, profoundly impactful for a couple of reasons. One is most of the time when people start working on things in a new Agile team, they don't know the requirements. Right? We're told we're gonna go deep just in time. We're not gonna dig into requirements. And what happens for new teams is they go off blind. So what release planning does is fill in that blank for them and lets them understand exactly what the end goal is for this short period of time, which is fundamentally important. And I think it's one of the mistakes that I made first when I was doing this Agile team. Every sprint review, oh, we're Agile. We're gonna show and tell. We got feedback on this requirement and let's go back and fix it. And let's go back and fix it. And oh, the backlog can be prioritized dynamically before every sprint planning, and cool. Okay, we've just rebuilt the same widget 7 times. Like, was that really what we wanted to do? So we're trying to really, really impact that cycle, which is a very, very easy one to fall into. The second thing that it does is gets feedback from the team of what they actually believe they can do. Now, how many of you think engineers are optimistic with estimates? I love that about them. I love that about them. These teams, even with their deepest optimism and belief, and these were such lovely people, right? They had given up their Saturdays the year earlier and they still didn't quit. Believed they could do 1/3 of what their managers had previously promised. And I swear that was more than they could do. And for me, the power of release planning is hearts and minds, and I always talk about the importance of hearts and minds. I think if a team signs up to do something and they believe it, they can do anything, and they've amazed me over and over and over again. So that's what bottom-up planning did. And if I had to sort of grade it, I'd go, yeah, they've got mechanics, right? They understand Scrum, we train them, they're having daily stand-ups, do their retros work, are they awesome? We heard some of that this morning. I don't know, maybe okay. But I also think it's highly fragile. Because in that environment, the normative culture that was so embedded was based on this leader who was no longer there, but he had, deputies throughout the organization who had now taken a back seat to different behaviors that we wanted from the organization. But they're looking for the minute this goes wrong. Not because they're bad people, but that is where they know how to be successful. And in this new world, they don't know how to be successful, and it is frightening. So it was kind of, middle ground. And where I would say we are is the teams were way more aligned because they were all executing to the same cadence. They all used the same language, the same artifacts, so dependencies were flowing a lot better. I had this really hilarious experience where I was working with their project management team before any teams had launched, and they were like, how do we deal with dependencies? And I go, well, there's no code, so who cares? And they were like, no, but dependencies are gonna come. We know it's a complex system. And I go, I absolutely agree they will. And they go, so how do we deal with that? And I go, why don't we ask the teams when the dependencies emerge and they'll decide how they want to work. I can give you a bunch of things, like you could do a scrum of scrums, or you could do sort of daily stand-ups, or there's a ton of things. But why do we have to figure that out now? Who cares? So there was this always sort of confidence need, and I think that this is a really strong pattern, right? We want to predict the future, right? And if we've written everything down, the world will emerge in a way that feels comfortable for us. And yet historically, every time they did that, they failed. So what we were continuously doing was asking them to get out of their comfort zone and see who would step up to the plate. Now, bad news came earlier, which I think is the best gift we can give any leadership team. Because if this team that bottom-up planned has now revealed they can do 1/3 of the MVP, at that point, those leaders have choices, right? I can resource a new team. I can get a different backlog in place. I can rethink this whole thing, right? At that point, you have choices. We know what happens when you add people to the end of a stressful cycle, right? Everything slows down and grinds to a halt. But at the beginning, that doesn't happen. So bad news, and by the way, we run into technical risk, we run into it early, right? That's what we do in Agile. We always try and bring risk forward. But what we had to train them on was embracing bad news as an opportunity to make better decisions versus let's just throw this all out. Because I remember the first time I planned in Agile, and like in waterfall at the beginning, everything feels good, right? Because you're all on track, it's green. And you've done nothing except write documents and checked off stuff, but crap, you feel good, right? You have a kickoff, everybody's excited, it's green. And in Agile, the worst thing happened. The teams were at their slowest. When I did velocity predictions, like based on the number of story points they're doing, this project will take 17 years. They're gonna fire me. So we had to get them comfortable with bad news early as an opportunity and a gift. And the other thing is, these teams had a history of accruing technical debt, right? That's why they had to throw out the software, because it was actually easier to rebuild from scratch than it was to fix it. They had some deep-seated bugs that were performance scalability bugs that are just, you're out, you're dead. So we had to really reshape that bad news. We brought in high visibility in this sort of sprint review that everybody was invited to. And remember, I told you that organization was mistrusted. So all of a sudden, the salespeople are like, well, we want to see what the heck these people have been doing for the past couple of weeks, because we're working our butt off and we're not seeing any delivery. So the stakes in that were weird, right? It wasn't a, hey, here's a sprint review, let's get feedback from our stakeholders. It was like, what is the dev team doing? And as a result, because it was such a heavyweight thing, that high visibility was not a safe zone to admit failure, right? It turned into smoke and mirrors. We wound up killing it, because I kept trying to, encourage and almost bribe, but I'm told that's not okay, a product owner to stand up and say, actually, our plan blew up this sprint. We took a back step. It just wasn't safe. And you can't do that when all of your peers are like showing charts. Charts. Oh, we did PowerPoint and charts. And look at that. They were like doing spikes just to do sort of prototyping and spikes because that's easy to do, right? You're not delivering anything, you're learning. Sure, that's great, but at a certain point, you got to build something. So there was all this weird stuff. And because the trust was so slow to build, we had to continuously sort of look at how much visibility can we maintain and still be safe and fail fast. But what I will credit the leadership with is more honest conversations. And that was extreme growth. And again, to me, this is a path to agility, right? It's a path, right? And people go on a journey. And those were huge leaps forward because in the past, it wasn't possible to talk about the fact that they couldn't deliver. So that's my company number 2. The third one I want to talk to you about is Salesforce. I am, with extreme sort of arrogance, putting it on the scale. I'm sure there's other companies that are much further along the evolutionary scale. But for me, I only appreciated Salesforce when I left Salesforce. So I'm going to give you a little bit around that. The first thing I want to say is I joined Salesforce in 2008. They did their original R&D rollout in 2006. So the backpedal environment was Salesforce had previously been delivering 4 times a year. Back in 1999, they started as a company. They were, because they were in the cloud, had the ability to ship 4 times a year and created this really beautiful relationship with their customers, where customers would give them very detailed feedback that shaped the roadmap and enabled Salesforce as a company to build trusted relationships and products people wanted. Awesome. By 2006, the R&D organization had grown to about 200 people, and it was a waterfall, and everything slowed down, and they didn't ship for a year. The date slipped 12 times inside that environment because being in the cloud, there was a high consciousness about quality, right? People didn't really trust the cloud, so if you found a bug, it was your first reason to just get off the train of cloud and go back into the on-prem world back in those days. So if quality is your number one thing that you're trying to optimize for and your test cycle is at the end, you're stuck. So they had this big aggressive rollout they had hired some cool consultants and created, some risk-taking teams. And in 2006, did a pretty rapid 3-month rollout to Scrum. And they roadshowed it extensively and talked about how easy it was. And I remember sitting in 2007 listening to this saying, this is bunk. Because it can't be that easy. You can't just put a magic wand in and say, yeah. It did. And they had done certain things really, really well that they didn't talk about in their story. In advance of this Agile rollout, they'd made a huge investment in environments and test infrastructure, right? For those of us who do this, you can't go fast unless you have a lot of automation. So they had those things that were key enablers. So I want to give you what I saw when I joined. I was their very first Agile coach hire in 2008. So here's what I saw, because bless their heart. Go back. Thanks. So bless their heart on this. They hired me anyway, even though I told them I thought their story was bunk. So they had done this exquisitely good rollout, and I credit those people tremendously, of Scrum. But what I saw, and by the way, the Salesforce environment was you had these 4-month releases, and 3 months of those were up until feature freeze. So teams were doing 30-day waterfalls, 3 30-day waterfalls to a 5-week feature freeze release process. It's not really Agile. Bless. And I still saw of this 30-day cycle, and it's why I've never been comfortable with a 30-day cycle. I've got a week to do design, I've got 2 weeks to do dev, and then I've got 1 week to do QA, and nobody talks to each other, and the QA people are really tired because it's their fault when you don't finish the sprint. And that all existed, right? And that's what I saw. Now, were they executing better? Sure as heck they were. And what they were able to do at that point was make scope a variable, which they were really, really good at, and turn features off and always pick a date and shift. So fantastic, right? Good progress. But I didn't think it was Agile. I thought it was good, but not agile. And leaders were hedging their bets. So leaders who wanted something were still creating competing teams. They didn't call them that, who were all sort of working to the same end. And lo and behold, what does that happen? Wow, a lot of non-collaboration, right? Because somebody's going to win and somebody's going to lose. And the only place that I felt like there was healthy cross-functional collaboration was at the Scrum team level. And those Scrum teams actually were pretty good. Even though QE was sort of, at the tail end and a little bit tired, overall, they worked pretty well together. They had these, 7-person teams all over the place, and they were persistent, and there was goodness there. But would I have characterized them as, culturally agile? No. So, we trained everyone on the why. And I'm going to be really honest. To me, I think mechanics are really, really helpful, and I have a ton of mechanics in my toolbox. I started doing extreme programming, right? I learned Scrum, I know Kanban, right? I think knowing all those things and Lean is great and helpful, and we need to know those things. So I don't want to hate on mechanics. But for me, I want people to know the why, and I want them to question everything. If you can't explain the why to somebody, you should not do it. And I think that that's really important to sort of push that responsibility deep into those teams and that organization. And as a result, you start to have more challenging conversations, and it's harder, but I think in the end, the process becomes in the ownership and hands of the people using it versus being done to them. We really focused on quick feedback loops. So let's actually have sprint reviews be a lot more dynamic. Let's actually have tests be a lot more real and dynamic around those things. And let's look for organizational blockers and systemic blockers and focus on removing them. And then we looked at this cross-functional problem where we got to a point where I actually think those executives that were vaguely dysfunctional got to be more functional. But that middle team actually were highly functionally aligned and siloed. So this thing that happened, and it was about 3 years in, I'm going to say like 2011, was we brought in this thing called a program core team, which by the way is not sort of a Salesforce invention. We read it in a program management book. So sorry, nobody invented this. But what it did was we created this idea of a cross-functional team at a mid-tier level that was empowered to make decisions that were business-oriented decisions to pivot. And it was like a meta Scrum team. And that thing was powerful because no longer did I have, the business oriented against tech and sort of diversified. That group debated and brought things together. And having them be part of a cross-functional team and have to deal with the pain and suffering of aligning each other, they started to understand what they were asking of their people. And their behavior changed. And I think that that was like a huge one. And then because that entity, which was now mid-tier, became a lot more functional, those executives were able to push decision-making deeper to them. So that was a big deal. And where we got to is product pivots are pretty easy at Salesforce. So when I was there, the CEO, who at Salesforce is a pretty dynamic guy, will have a certain product vision that he really wants to double down on and go big on. A lot of companies have this, but they can't execute to it. So at one point, we had a team working on the underlying technology of the feed for this product called Chatter, which is a ripoff of Facebook and Twitter for the enterprise. It's kind of like a Yammer. And he wanted this social thing, right? There's this big conference called Dreamforce. He wanted to put it on the stage. We were one release away. And we had this little team in a different office working on this, totally outside of the system, working in their own speed. And all of a sudden, it was kind of like, you got to do it, guys, or the world's going to collapse. We're going to lose everything. He's going to be super pissed off and fire us all. And what we did was we pivoted 28 teams in one go. And we could do that. And it was because they all worked on the same cadence and they were all able to do that. Now, where we are right now is I think there are teams that are high performing. I think there are teams that are sloppy. I think you see the ecosystem of it. And I think that that's the trade-off that we take to let them own their process. But Agile is pretty much part of the culture. My little anecdote is when I quit, there was this guy who I barely knew who started telling everyone I quit. And I was like, oh, why does he care? I mean, that's kind of weird. I don't know him that well. Because he thought my leaving meant Agile went away. And he was celebrating. No, it didn't. So, with all of those tales, let me give you my hit list around the stuff that I tend to do when I'm trying to sort of look at the culture and impact it. So, number one, data. When you have to work with senior people, so much of what you are showing them is tightly connected to their own actions. So we got to recognize that because it's hard. And the only way to do that is not to come in with opinion, but to come in with data. So I saw these two teams competing. It was so clear to me. I didn't go to that executive and say, hey, by doing this, you did this and this, because he would have thrown me out of his office. I did large retros with all those people and gathered the data and presented it in the most objective way possible, in the most respectful way possible, because he's a smart guy. He'll draw the conclusion and he'll make those connections. And I do a lot of that, right? I think doing interviews, observation, but I try and be as objective as possible with the data. Again, I'm a sociologist, so I just try and craft that data. And then I think about this in the most humane, empathetic, kind way I possibly can. So you've got to give people time to absorb it and be kind with it. Because it's hard, right? Most of the time, if we're going in to transform, we're generally seeing an environment where things were awesome and then they got not awesome and now they need to get awesome again. And it's a painful place to be. The next piece is my reminder that change is incredibly hard. And the reason I have a picture of a surgeon here is somebody gave me the stat a couple years ago and it stayed with me. They said bypass patients who undergo, life-saving surgery are generally given very direct instructions around lifestyle changes, reduce stress, diet, exercise that they need to do in order to not die. Stakes are kind of high, right? Die. And after 2 years, what percentage of those people generally have adopted them? Anyone? 5. You guys are more depressing than reality. It's 10%. And if you can understand that, you understand how hard it is to change. So I take that on board because I'm pretty persistent, because that change is going to be really, really hard. And Agile is people, right? Agile is not process. So we got to just understand that. And the other piece is, right, Agile will shine a light on every single dysfunction out there, and we're going to have to deal with it. So next is what I think we did extremely well in definitely Salesforce, but even like what we were doing at eBay was we were aligning changes to values. So I am at eBay right now, and we had to roll out a universal definition of done. Most of the time you do that, people go, crap, you're giving us a ton of rules that are telling us how to behave. Sucks to be us. We don't want to do it. And I've seen a lot of gaming on definition of done. We did something different. When we were talking to developers and asking them why they had accrued a ton of technical debt, they talked about that with regret. We don't work at our best because we're given timelines that we can't do. We have to work too quickly. We are told we have to do all these things from the business, and we don't feel good about it. So we go, great. Definition of done, which is really, quality standards and test standards and development standards and what it means to incrementally deliver, is your permission to do the right thing and return to the integrity of your job. It was the best adoption I've ever seen. And I think aligning that to what people value inside, and it's not that hard to do. Because Agile actually is about people, and it tends to align to things that we really care about. So that's important, and focus on the why. You know, we're all smart people, right? So we're questioning everything, and we're doing the what's in it for me. And we're really trying to craft a story so that people have personal motivations, because again, I'm saying culture top down and bottom up. And then look at continuous improvement. But I also want to pause and say the reason why I went sort of at length in these 3 company scenarios was because you got to be honest about what's possible. And it doesn't mean what's possible today is the same thing that's possible 6 months from now, but you also have to be honest about what's possible. I was not going to go in that first scenario and say, oh, you're going to deliver like Speedy Gonzalez and it'll be amazing and your customers will be thrilled if none of these other change factors emerge. You just can't. So I think we need to take bold steps. I like bold steps. Again, what dissatisfied me about the rollout that I worked on with British Telecom was it was a 14,000 person rollout. They said, this is how we're going to scale. Everybody does stand-ups and retros. It'll be good. Well, sure, they're talking more. Are they able to incrementally deliver customer value? No. So it wasn't a big, bold step. It didn't make things uncomfortable. It didn't ruffle any feathers. And I like big, bold steps because that is the only way I learn, because I fail. And I don't know how to get better without failing. So I embrace failure. I focus on the systemic stuff. I let things get messy. And if things go wrong unexpectedly, I go back to data. I go back to understanding what's going on. Let me do large retros. Let me figure it out. And I understand that changes both have positive and negative results, right? In the industry, we will quote 20% attrition numbers. And if it is not okay, because most of the time these companies are bleeding people anyway, we got to talk about that, because we cannot protect all the people. Some people are going to choose to go, and that has to be okay. So just like, let's be mindful about that. And then I'm like, don't forget the frozen middle. The best saboteurs I have had of any transformation are the mid-level management, and it is not their fault. It is our fault. We didn't give them a new job. We've got to give them skin in the game. We have to set them up for success. Otherwise, they will sabotage it both unwittingly or deliberately. And then my next one is I'm always curious. So we've got to be honest and curious. And like to my earlier comment about sort of the Salesforce story, when I first heard it, if it feels too easy, I don't think you went deep enough. But if it feels too hard and the whole organization is staging a revolution, you probably have gone a little too far. For now. So you gotta sort of pitch it, right? And we've got to be really iterative about this and incremental. And then I'm always about, can you go forward a slide? I look for pockets of goodness. Sometimes those pockets are small, sometimes those pockets are big, and I just shine a light and show what's possible. And some of this is a smidge pedantic, so I'm going to apologize in advance, but I see a lot of Agilists preaching, and I see a lot of Agilists arguing. Please don't do that. You won't win. Lead by example, be eminently patient, but experiment and show results, right? It always, like if we are doing that, we will see success and celebrate the success and find the evangelists who are arguing for you, because that's pretty powerful. And we know the haters, if we can convert those haters, they are the people who speak the most loudly. So that's cool too. And then stay focused on the outcome. So the end game, right? This is a long, long journey, and recognize they will change over time. Right? Transformation is not an end state. Cultural agility is not an end state, right? It's how we think, it's how we move, it's what our norms are. And always kind of go back and measure and make sure and sort of take a step back. And I always just look for progress, improvement. That's what I want. That's what I want to evaluate my sort of journey on. So, final thoughts. Go. So, you know, I wish I could say like the Salesforce transformation journey was over, but I don't think it is. I don't think any transformation journey is ever over. I think companies come into new data points and they always have to sort of deal with those new inputs and those new things. And they have different trade-offs and choices they could take. So I don't want us to ever sort of get lazy and go done. But I think when your hearts and minds are sort of committed to a way of thinking, your chance of success is dramatically different. And the more that we can bring those people in, the more we can see that emerge. Not every organization is going to change. And I think that's also something that we have to be honest with. I don't take every client. And sometimes clients fire me. And that's okay. Well, it's not. It sort of sucks at the time. But you got to kind of understand what you're working with and what you're capable of doing, and just be very, very honest about it and do what's possible today and just look for continuous improvement. That is all I got. Do we have a couple?
I think we have time for a couple of questions. Okay, Mike, go ahead.
With my wild gesturing. Hi.
Hello. Several times throughout, you talked about measuring stuff.
Yeah.
And showing it, but what are you measuring? What metrics are you actually using that work?
Yeah, I think it's a really great question because I kind of suck at metrics. Because I think a lot of metrics create anti-patterns. So I'll tell you what I don't measure. I don't measure velocity, ever. What I'm measuring is really what comes out of a retro. And what are people saying and what are they talking about are the things that I'm talking about in data. I think depending on what the outcomes are that you're trying to achieve, you measure only specifically those outcomes. I don't believe in having more than 3 or 4 metrics. So at Salesforce, we really measured quality and understood that if the code line stayed high quality, there would be faster throughput because there was less technical debt. But when I'm talking about data and measuring the success, because I'm really focused on culture, I'm looking at the temperature of the culture and talking to other people and seeing what comes up there and seeing if that changes. So every 6 months at Salesforce, we ran a survey and we asked a couple of questions that I thought were really important. We asked, would you recommend sort of our brand of Agile to your friends and colleagues outside of the company? And I had a 94% approval rating, which meant we weren't doing bad things to people. That was my measurement that I really cared about. We asked people if they were having fun, and we asked people if they were working at a sustainable pace.
That's true, but the executives cared about that?
The executives cared about that because it actually yielded more features. The outcome, by the way, of all of this beautiful Agile people stuff was large revenue growth. I didn't care about revenue growth. I wasn't accountable for revenue growth. And I think, if you make individuals too connected to business outcomes like that, you lose the plot. I think if people are faced with dealing with their best work and we're lean and we're measuring sort of reduction of waste and those things that I think are interesting, the business results will happen and carry forward. So, and I suck at metrics. I'm kind of lazy with them.
I think we had one question right there past. Yeah, you're.
It's my happy, huggy message to you all.
Hi.
Hi.
We have been Agile for like 2 years, 1.5 years, kind of. So I'm still the.
You make it sound like a destination. I got there.
Yeah. So my question was, I had a lot of question concern, but let me just stick to one. My question was on the dependencies. You were very explicit. Let's not talk about dependencies when you're starting a project. Let's bring it as it goes. We generally have big projects. We have 10 to 12 teams.
Yep, so did we.
Yeah, hardware, software, mix, blah, blah. If we don't define at least which team is involved, how they will come, when they will come, to start with, it becomes really difficult to deliver that project. So my question is, how can we ignore and how we move forward with this idea without dependencies, which we are not aware of.
But we didn't move forward with this idea that dependencies didn't exist. We said when they emerge, we'll let the teams decide how they want to deal with them.
We are talking 2 years project, 1 year project.
But a 2-year project isn't delivered in 2 years. You should be delivering it incrementally, which means the dependencies change and we learn as we go. What I didn't want is a bunch of project managers figuring out the process and then pushing it out, because it's wrong. It's the wrong process only because it's just not the process that the people want to use. I said, I'm going to create bottom-up release planning so all the teams kind of know and they're talking to each other. So I have a plan. My plan is not more than 4 months, because the fact is, in 2 years, if I have learned nothing in those 4 months, I don't know what the heck's going to happen in 2 years, and my business environment doesn't work that way. So all I'm saying is dependencies are real and they're important, but I would prefer the teams that have to work together make the decision around how best to work together than to prescribe it. I can give them ideas to start with and not say, well, make it up. I just don't want to define it. I don't want to predefine it. And I think we spend too much time predefining it and then trying to fit people into what we've defined versus pushing that responsibility and the real knowledge and the openness and the transparency and the feedback loops.
Great. Thank you, Nicola. We'll have some. I think she'll be outside. We can chat a little bit more. I know there's a ton of questions, but we just don't have the time to.
I know I
cover all
talked
of
too
them.
long. I'm sorry.
No, we just want more of you.
I'm a terrible social networker, but I am on LinkedIn. So if you want to keep talking, connect with me. I'm happy to.
Great. Thank you, Nicola.
Thank you.